Good. Yeah.
Okay.
So 1 through, he is reading out of the ESV, 1 through 16. Yeah.
Yes. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sister sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with them.
All right. Does anyone have anything that stuck out to them before we hop in?
Well, I just want to say this is like one of my favorite passages in John, just because it is so like it seems pretty simple, like what you learn as a child. It's like, okay, you
Right.
raise someone from the but it's like so packed with meaning. And
Mhm.
our pastor a couple of years ago did a dissection of that, just those 16 verses there, and it was just like unbelievable the stuff that
Right.
came out of that and everything. So I was excited we were starting with this.
I know this is a little odd of a choice. I think in the Google Doc I even mentioned, because I was looking to see like if there are pre-existing Easter studies sort of where they started and everything when I initially was conjuring this up, and I couldn't find anybody that started with this. But this sort of sets the stage in a way for us. This is the final miracle in John, and it's also a bookend of the like it's the way that like I mentioned, you don't get to take a nap when you're reading John, and so the way that it sort of bookends the science, it's beautiful. But this is also one of the main like tipping point things for the council going after Jesus, because it's like, oh, okay, let's go, we're gonna get you now. And so I wanted to kind of scooch us back. Plus, context is always good. Context is always key. And so gotta back up a little bit for that anyway. But who is Lazarus? And I promise it's not a trick question.
Mary and
I'm gonna
Martha's
make Noah the
brother.
author. He's a man, right? He's just a man. He is not the same Lazarus out of, I think it's Luke's gospel, the parable. Not the same person. Friend of Jesus, sure. Um, this Lazarus is actually only mentioned in the Gospel of John, which is fun. And one of the main theories around this is the fact that John was written last. And so the other, especially the uh, for Matthew and Mark, because they were so close to or were disciples, they understood the sort of need for anonymity. There are a couple of people that are kind of left nameless or very vague from the synoptics. But then John's like, actually, it was Peter that did that, and he did it to this guy named Malchus, and so this need for anonymity because the temple's destroyed, right? Like John is at least right now believed to have been written in the 90s, and so he was just sort of like, okay, like, what are you gonna do to me now? I don't know. Everybody's dead. This guy's already dead. You can't kill him again. And so he starts naming people and giving more details and things like that for kind of because why not a little bit. But yeah, he's just a friend of Jesus. I have seen a silly amount of people trying to claim that they were more than friends in the last 2 weeks while I've been researching this. And I don't think any of you here think that, but don't. Don't do that. It's not what that word means.
Okay. Nipped at me because I had no two rounds.
Stop petting the cat. I gotta show you guys.
Oh,
She's angry because she can't get on the desk.
That's her basket net. You guys have heard me talk about before. Her little basket of wonder that she sleeps in. Because otherwise she just tries to sit directly on my desk, and my desk is not even big enough to hold my Bible, much less also my cat. So, yeah, friend of Jesus. This friend is the brother of Mary, right? And she is mentioned as being the one who anointed Jesus. This isn't because this already happened. We have no reason to believe that John's narrative is out of order in this regard. It's just that is what she was known for, which was promised to her, right? Matthew's gospel, Matthew 26. Yeah, Matthew 26:13. And then I think it's Mark. I don't know. It's probably in the Google Doc. But it's a promise from Jesus that she will be remembered, right? This thing that she has done, she will be remembered. And so here's evidence of that. When John then is writing his gospel, he is mentioning her as, oh, you know that girl that did this? She's here. So I just think that's fun. But, so Misty, the one that was here, my cousin, one of her kids is special needs. She's CP and autism and was like abused the first full 8 years of her life. I'd never seen a doctor, like awful, awful. She started having seizures a couple of days ago. I don't know if you guys have seen some of the stuff I've been sharing to try to like they've got like a meal train going for them and stuff. But apparently that little girl Layla is having seizures again, so she had to step out. But be praying for them. That's awful.
Mm-hmm.
She had two?
I told her we were playing.
She had two seizures. Okay. All right. So we see this mention in verse 6. It says, so when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. And I actually, a little bit surprisingly, now that I saw a handful of commentaries, a couple of sermons that were saying like, yeah, he did this so that Lazarus would die and then he could raise him from the dead. That doesn't line up, right? Bethany's only about 2 miles from Jerusalem, and so if Bethany's only 2 miles from Jerusalem, there's not really anywhere Jesus could be at this point that's more than maybe a couple hours walk. And so if Jesus receives this news and then stays 2 days longer, and then he gets to Lazarus, he's already been dead for 4 days. Lazarus was already dead, had been dead for a while. It wasn't like the news came and then Lazarus died or anything like that. And so I do want to put that out there because some pastors saying things like that. That doesn't line up. That doesn't make any sense. He stayed 2 days longer to make this miracle undeniable. Lazarus had also been dead the longest out of all the resurrection miracles, including Jesus himself. And so for him to have already been dead for 4 days, I mean, decomp would have set in. Like he would have been stanky, you know. Yes.
I wanted to add something in that my pastor had said about that was he was talking about that it was not uncommon in that culture of the time to like if someone passed or something that they could there was the belief that was like, well, maybe, they can come back. It's just a short, and all this stuff. And that usually by like the third day or, whatever, it was like, okay, they've died.
They're
They're
dead.
dead. And so it was like at that point there was no concluding that, that people could come and say, well, it was,
Yeah.
this and everything.
Yeah. It's he would have been stinky. And I mean, even we see a little bit later on that Martha's like, he's stinky. You don't want to take this. Let's not open that. Let's not. And it's all we can kind of guess when this took place. John does not mention specifically, but we know just prior, verse 22 of chapter 10 says at the time of the Feast of Dedication, which is in like December-ish. And then this is pre-Passover, so like early spring, late March, early April. So this is maybe like now time of year. Um, that's in the desert. They're going to start getting like a pretty decent amount of sun, a pretty decent amount of heat. Lazarus is going to be able to stay. There's no, and it seems to be that he wasn't embalmed or anything, at least not fully. There was no like full burial practice, which I didn't see anybody comment on, but I think is just a little odd. But you know, so Mary, which we'll get to this next week, but we've already seen it mentioned here. She's the one that is anointing Jesus with a lot of these sort of, it's like made out of embalming spices and it's really expensive. But the sort of burial ritual wasn't particularly expensive. And so if she had this incredibly expensive perfume of some sort, um, then why didn't they fully take care of Lazarus? The only thing that I did find was that he seemed to be like probably really, really contagious. And so nobody wanted to touch him. They were just like wrap him, put him in the cave, close the door. Nobody got anywhere near him. And that wasn't necessarily like a super common thing. Like there weren't, just like there isn't now, something that is going to just drop you all of a sudden. And there's no mention of him previously being sick or that there was anything going on. Um, so whatever he had took him. But I don't know. No, we don't know. I know in Jewish customs today that someone has to stay with the body, but I can't remember. Yes, I don't know either. Off the top of my head, but I do know what you're talking about. And then with they have like a different grief ritual, or at least they did, um, where grief was much more of like a thing. It was a full process. They were hired mourners, and then people would come from all over the place and mourn with you just anyway, like your, distant friends and things would be because, and you got to think about too, it's a much smaller space. Jerusalem is a small city. And so if someone is on one side of Jerusalem and then someone's in like a couple towns over, well, it's still like the equivalent of going to like a nearby suburb for us, in a lot of these major cities. And so but grief was a much bigger thing, and we'll see that a little bit more. The Jews that are mentioned with Mary that are there to mourn with her. We'll see that in a little bit. Um, and I don't think I put this in the doc. I don't think I actually wrote it down anywhere. So I hope that I remembered what I'm going to say. um, but yeah, so Lazarus was stinky by now. But 2 days longer, and then they say, why are we going there again? They just tried to stone you. And for reference, that is verse 31 of chapter 10. They just tried to stone you. They just tried to arrest you. What are you doing? And he says, are there not 12 hours in the day? And this honestly means a couple of things. But the one that I want to focus on is because John's gospel in particular speaks a lot about my hour has not yet come, or my hour has come. We see this mentioned, I think, 3 or 4 times throughout the narrative. Something will happen, and he says, my hour has not yet come, my time has not yet come. And we kind of don't know what to do that, so we scooch right past it. But we know that he's talking about the Passion Week, that's the hour that is to come. And this 12 hours is sort of alluding to the same thing. He's phrasing it differently, but if a workday is 12 hours, and that's kind of what he's talking about with them, this sort of, for laborers, you work from sunup to sundown, so they have like 12 hours to work, and then 12 hours of night. And that's also sort of how like Jewish time is kept anyway, like their days begin in the evening and things like that. But if anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks at night, he stumbles. And he's sort of combining two things here. He's saying there's 12 hours, meaning I still have time. I realize that they just tried to stone me. I'm going to be okay. Everybody calm down. But then he's talking about if you walk in the light, you won't stumble. Just like attaching that right back on. And I think it's just mostly pointing back to the fact he's already announced that he's the light of the world. Right. And so I think it's easy enough to say that this is mostly just that. This sort of, I'm not afraid. You don't have to be afraid. You're literally with me. We're fine. We're cool. Everybody calm down. It's gonna be okay. Um yes, John 17 is when he starts saying that his hour has come. So we're good.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
adjusting the seat.
Booty.
It's a hard seat.
I'm on like an old wooden chair in the corner. There, read. You and I read that he says Lazarus has fallen asleep, and we know what he means. Even if we did not already know that Lazarus was dead, we would probably just kind of infer, we'd figure it out. He's meaning that Lazarus is dead. This is not a new literary device. This is something that is used extra biblically. This is not just something from the Bible, but plenty of poetry from the dawn of time has used this imagery of sleep, because when people pass away, if you've ever been to like a funeral or something, they look like they're asleep, you know. And funeral homes work really hard now to make sure people look like they're asleep. That's the gimmick, right? But why do his disciples think that he's just taken a nap? Right? He's, oh well, if he's asleep, then he'll be fine. They seem to have this idea that he will be cured. He's just taking a nap, like he's got the flu. Isaac is sleeping, but he'll be fine. He's just got to sleep it off. But if that's like a common thing in the Old Testament and across literature, I mean, throughout the book of Genesis alone, we see so and so passed away and they slept with their fathers. so and so passed away and they slept with their father. And these men aren't necessarily educated men, but they're walking around with God. And some of them are a little bit more educated. There's plenty of evidence to point to the fact that at least Matthew alone had some education. And then all of these Jewish men would have received some level of education just from being around, the same way that we all have sort of like Christianese things that we pass to each other. All of it's correct. There's some crazy things that we say to each other that's just not right. There's no theology behind it. But some of it's just, maybe it gets kind of twisted over time, but it's like close enough that it's fine. Why on earth do they think that he's just asleep? And honestly, I don't have an answer for you. But if any of you have any theories, I'll listen to them. I will say, and I don't know if I put all these in the document. The gospel changes this from a expression to a fact, and I know that that's in there, where he's just asleep is now true. He's just sleeping. And we see this in Matthew 27:52, Acts 7:50, and 13:36, 1 Corinthians 7:39, and 11:30, and 15:6, and 15:18, and 1 Thessalonians 4:13, and 2 Peter 3:4. And those are just the ones I found. But I don't know. Do you actually, because you studied separate from me this time, do you have any ideas
That's why they didn't.
why they didn't catch on? I don't know, something about that like really scratches my head the wrong way, and I don't understand.
Maybe they got used to Jesus saying something was this way, and it is, such as the donkey being tied up, and so they went and found the donkey, or
Maybe, but that's
very
yeah,
other instances. I don't know,
they're not there yet.
but maybe they got used to Jesus saying this is going to be the way it is, and so they're like, okay, so it's just like,
I feel like I would be on my toes, man. She just swings wildly between being like very, very literal and speaking in riddles 3. And so if he says that someone has just fallen asleep after a messenger comes and says that someone is sick,
maybe also because Jesus said we're going to wait 2 more days. And
Maybe.
so if Jesus is in a rush, then surely he'll be fine
maybe.
because they
I
know
don't know.
Jesus loves him. So if someone you know you love, if someone you know that you love is ill and you know you can help them, why wouldn't you go immediately? And because you waited 2 days, maybe Jesus knows something they don't, so he's fine.
You took the note on love. Do you want to do that real quick?
Sure. So in verse 3, when they send to Jesus and say, Lord, he whom you love is ill. That word love is the Greek phileo, if I'm pronouncing it right. And it is to have affection for, or to be fond of.
It's like a
It's a
friendship.
friendship love. And then later in verse 5, it says, Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. And that is agape love. That is a selfless, sacrificial, unconditional love.
That is the love of God.
Yeah.
Anytime you see agape, which I see it get thrown around a lot with sort of R&B music specifically, which is, I don't know what's going on there. But maybe it's just like that. I was a big JoJo girl. I don't know if y'all remember JoJo, but she's always been a little bit more, influenced. That's the music that she grew up with. And so like she thought Leave Get Out was the most pop music she'd ever heard in her life. But all of us like little white girls were like, oh, But as she got older and was able to do whatever she wanted, or then got tied up and so I was a big fan for a long time, and she even did the agape thing, and I don't know, but that is the love of God. My last note here, and then we'll scooch into the next section. The rest of these sections are not going to take me as long. So, but this, I want to mention the book ending that I mentioned when we first started. This idea that the signs in the Gospel of John are opened and closed in this way. Verse 4 says that the Son of God may be glorified through it. And then verse 15 says that so you may believe. And this same idea is mentioned in the wedding at Cana, chapter 2, verse 11, if you want to look. The opening and closing miracle are both for the glory of God and are confirmations of faith. Just little funsies. Just little funsies. No? You ready?
Right.
This is 17 through something.
27.
27.
27? Now, when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give it. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world.
All right. Does anyone have anything before I start yapping my head off? Y'all know I can do it. Okay, so it would seem, and this is something that I saw contradicted. So, and something I think I have already contradicted in telling you, but I'm going to read this note. It would seem as if Christ's miraculous power of knowing without the ordinary means of information was not in constant activity, but like his other miraculous powers, was only employed on fitting occasions. It was necessary for his work to know of Lazarus's death, but not how long or where he'd been buried. And it makes me think of, do you guys remember the Santa Claus 2, where he only has so much magic he can use before he runs out? And that's what that makes me think of. And that makes me think that that's probably not what's going on. But I saw multiple scholars, and this is the Cambridge Bible for schools and colleges, their commentary. They're usually fun. And so I had to write that note down because I was like, okay, well, maybe. I feel like, I don't know. I don't like it.
It feels like we're putting a limitation on Jesus.
But there is, I don't want to say evidence, but there's something to it, right? Because if he, as a human, had the full wherewithal all the time, he would be able to bypass certain aspects of being human, like being caught in the middle of a desert, thirsty and dehydrated, where he could just know where the nearest water source is and plan ahead. And these things, there might be something to it, but I see that you
Heard
have
the
unmuted.
debate of trying to figure out if, some people trying to figure out that fully God, fully human aspect
Right.
of things, and like the concept that he would have, would Christ have known like all these nuances, like you said, and also carrying the weight of like knowing, the aspects of DNA and all this stuff. And
Yeah.
it's like it kind of loses a little something, of like you said, of like if it's completely where it's like he knows everything at every second and everything, and it does kind of boggle your mind of trying to figure out that fully human, fully God kind of thing.
Was he born knowing tough Torah, quoting it from verse?
Yeah. And I mean, but also he is the word.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I spent like 2 hours trying to get to the bottom of what everybody believed and then figure out and I felt like I was just gonna sit in the corner and just like boo 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 for a while. It's just like what what's going on? And it's just we are finite trying to comprehend the infinite, but then on top of that, the infinite then incarnate into something finite. I don't like it. I don't get it. I don't want to know anymore. Leave me alone. But I did want to read that note to you guys. Just I think we do kind of always sit in this. Jesus could do all things always, all the time, while he's human. But did he know about the iPhone? I don't know how I feel with that. I think that would have been wrong. That feels incorrect. And also, but if he did and then didn't do anything about it, that's the same way, like people, if we had some level of foreknowledge, we would try to profit off of it.
Profit off of it or
there's
try to
whole
prevent certain things from happening.
well, there's whole movies about like if you knew the lottery numbers ahead of time, or you could like invent, like if he knew about the iPhone, then
Well, and it also raises the question of like beforehand, before like when he was a child and everything, if he was born with all this knowledge and wisdom, then, you know, was it, I mean, you can't, then he would have known how to walk and talk and it'd have been
yeah,
all great. And if he didn't, and he was just concealing it so that, Mary and Joseph had to teach him, that kind of seems deceitful, which we know he wouldn't
right,
have done.
yeah. I just imagine Mary, like if you've been around little kids, or if you are like Katie, you're a mom, you know that like if Penny could have already known how to walk and you did not have to teach her, and she's struggling and you're just like, why don't you walk? I know you know how. Just imagine that she was occasionally like, I know that you're God. Look me in the eye and stop this right now. And he's just in there like,
I remember
I'm a baby. I don't know you're not
seeing a funny picture of Mary trying to bathe Jesus, but baby Jesus is just standing on top of the bathwater.
Perfect. Oh, Lord. Okay. So Martha's words to Jesus, she says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And these are not a rebuke, though they do a little bit seem that way, especially depending on the translation. It seems much more a regret. Had they maybe sent for Jesus sooner, if you had just been here, it would have been fine. But we didn't send the messenger out in time and you weren't here, and so now Lazarus is dead. It doesn't seem like, well, you were supposed to know. You should have been here. Maybe you're not God, kind of thing. Like it's not like that. Um, but she goes on to say, and I will say this but at the top of 22, she says, but even now, it's argued that shouldn't even be there, that it should just run. So if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, he will give you. And I think that makes more sense. I think that sounds better. It makes it sound less like a rebuke. Like, well, if you had been here, but you're here now, I'll take what I can get, kind of thing. And Jesus says, your brother will rise again. And then Martha is like, yeah, I get it. Like the resurrection of the saints, which it's different for Christians now than what the Jewish people of that time would have believed, but it's similar enough. This idea that at some point, mostly during the Messianic age, that the dead would rise, which is a very similar sentence to the dead in Christ will rise. It's very, very similar, just some tweaking because their theology is naturally different than Christian theology. But that is one of the main dividing points between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, is this idea that angels and demons and people will come back to life and all this stuff, versus it's the Sadducees don't believe in all that, don't teach that. So Martha saying this outs her as a Pharisee. That is what she's talking about. She's like, yeah, like I know he'll rise on the last day, And Jesus' response is the fifth I am statement. And if you don't have these marked in your Bible, I recommend it. I don't recommend doing it like I did it because it's a pain in the butt. I recommend doing it. I had started out one of my I am statements was slobby. And so I ended up doing like this, where it looks framed and it looks cool, right? It's pretty. It's so thick that on the other side you're sitting there like trying to write on paper that's it's so irritating. But I recommend marking the I am statements if you haven't, or just highlighting them or something if you're not a note taker like I am. But what does this I am statement mean? And if y'all make Noelle talk, she's the only one who said anything. What does this I am statement mean? Well,
It means that he is the resurrection and the life.
Martine Reeves.
Hmm?
You can cheat. The notes are sitting in front of you. Technically, all of you can cheat as well because you have the Google Doc. So, oh, this resurrection, he is the author of the resurrection, which kind of also closes the first 2/3 of the Gospel of John, right? He opens with the fact that Jesus is the author of all of life. And now here at the closing of this section of John, we have he's also the author of like rebirth, re-life, right? All life forms through him, and that includes bringing people back to life. And this is mostly pointing at the fact that she was like, well, if you just ask God, he'll give it to you. And he's saying, I don't have to ask nothing. I'll do it. But the I am here is not, how did they word it? He does not merely have the power to resurrect, but is the very source of it. And I say that, and I read that, and I was like, yeah, that's the same sentence. And then I kept thinking about it and kept thinking about it because when we think about Jesus having power, or even God having power, an analogy that I see a lot is this sort of like light bulb type of thing, where like he says, "Let there be light," and then a light bulb cuts on, kind of thing. But him being the very source of it makes it much, much deeper and very different. And I want to encourage you guys to kind of sit and think about that because it's one of those things that I say to you, you've probably heard it before. Like he is the power. There is power in his name, right? We have all these songs. But what does that actually mean? What does that actually mean for us? And what does that actually mean about God and about Jesus? We kind of don't think about it. We think about a lot of other things. We think about the sins of our friends and we yell at them for being little sinners. And then but we don't think about God. We don't think about what that means. And I think that that's one of those things that you have plenty of that is too honorable. You could sit with that for a while. And so if you don't take anything else from this gap fest of mine, take that. Take that and run with it. Another thing that I want to point out, he says, whoever believes in me, though he die, he shall live. And then he asks, do you believe this? And the Moody commentary from the Moody Bible College says, believing the New Testament truths about Christ should not be distinguished from believing in the person of Christ, which was another one of those sentences that I was like, yeah. And then the more that I stared at it, preparing this, just taking more notes, the more that I was sitting there like, wait, hang on. And both of those notes should be in the Google document. If you're like, you're talking too fast, what are you saying? But believing the New Testament truths about Christ should not be distinguished from believing in the person of Christ.
That is
I don't know.
I love that. That is really good.
And I think I'm horribly, horribly guilty of that because we know the stories, especially if you grew up around it. If you grew up in sort of Christian circles, or like I've shared a little bit before, when I was little, when I was a toddler, I was in church and I was in Sunday school and I was around all the things. And then when I was about 5, we stopped going to church and just sort of completely unplugged. We didn't listen to the music. We didn't watch the TV shows. We like nothing. No prayer. No, no, now I'll lay me down to sleep. No, nothing. And but I knew some of these things because I incessantly watched some of these. Like he was a Veggie Plus kid and I was not. I was a Kids Sing Praise kid, and I had one of those VHS tapes until it wore out, and then I found it on YouTube because YouTube came along. Someone had already uploaded it, so I just watched it on the computer. And you learn these songs, and you learn these truths, and you know these things, and like, yeah, I know that he died on the cross. Yeah, I know that he blah blah blah, whatever. But then you don't think anymore about it. I don't know. That's very, very convicting for me. My
It's
last note
kind
for
of
this one is in
almost
Vespucci.
it's almost kind of like you have and we all use this because it's true, it's like about Christ, but do you
Right,
believe it in your heart? This is almost kind of like the next level under that of
right.
like, I believe him, but do I believe, it's like
I believe
deep,
it. Yeah,
kind of thing.
yeah. Do I soak it in, or am I just kind of floating on the water here?
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think I might be floating on the water sometimes, and it sort of, like I said, the more that it's written at like the very bottom of my page in the Bible, and so it's one of those that I kind of can't not look at it. Like I'm going to get to the bottom of the page and then see that and be like, oh, and then flip the page. And every time I've read that, I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if I believe in that. Why? And you immediately go into prayer. Help me. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. Start panicking in the corner. My last note, and then I'll let him read again. This uh, confession of faith mirrors that of Peter in Matthew 16:16. And so if you wanted to already write that down, you can. It also should be in the Google document. I think I put it in the Google document.
It's in there.
Okay. So Jesus weeps 28 through 37.
Yes.
Begin.
When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was, and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?"
All right. That's such an odd place for it to cut off, but that's the way that our translation does it. And so that's how all of the notes are laid out. And so that's how I'm going to carry it. But that should not be where I'm one of those people that I get mad when like chapter divisions shouldn't be there. So this is like a little annoying to me. But this name, the teacher or rabbi, this is one of the last times it's used in the gospel. And the title of teacher or rabbi is only used of Jesus in the gospels because that role is taken over by the Holy Spirit. So, little fun fact. I want to note that, and this is an old note, and it's probably not in Google document because it's not noteworthy, but Jesus could have come in kind of like guns blazing and taken care of Lazarus immediately. He could have just, everybody shut up, stop mourning, here we go, whatever. And, that doesn't really line up with the character of Jesus always, but then we also see him a little angry here, which we'll get to in a second. But he could have, but he did. He let them feel their emotions. He let Martha kind of, be Martha. She's actionable. She's the first one. She's rushing out there onto the scene. You're like, I'm meeting you here, and I'm sorry, and now you're here, and blah blah. And then meanwhile, Mary is crying and being very Mary, and he lets them both be who they are and feel what they're feeling. And so it's, I think more of an application note than a study note. But don't feel like however you feel your emotions is inherently wrong or bad, or that you can't feel them in the presence of God, because we have arguably two very different responses to grief, and Jesus lets them both happen. This mention of the Jews being with her, it's something I think the last section is where it started. But that is the probably mostly hired mourners there. Some of them probably did know Lazarus personally, and some may have been friends or other family. But this mention of the Jews in John's gospel is usually, and here is no different, probably denoting mostly people that don't like Jesus. It's never like the Jews. It's always, and the Jews are here. And when it is, it's like, well, the Jews, some of them believe. And then the rest of the time, like if it's not in that sentence, it's usually denoting someone who isn't necessarily like an enemy, not necessarily part of like the Sanhedrin, the council, but they're not believers. They're not followers of Jesus. And anyone who isn't following Jesus had potential to be a direct enemy. And it's important that you keep that in your head, because we'll come back to that in just a second. Mary's word for weep is different than Jesus's word. And if you're looking at the notes, then you can see, and I've got the links and stuff put in there. But her word, and I'm not going to try to pronounce them, is to weep aloud. It is uncontrollable. Just, she is grieving and she is crying. She is sobbing. It's exactly what you're picturing. But Jesus, his word is just to shed quiet tears. He's not also weeping. He's not also on the ground crying over Lazarus. And it looks like it's not even from grief at all. The word deeply moved, and again, I'm not going to try to pronounce this word, is the same word used to like warn somebody or to kind of be angry. Think like your mom sternly warning you. It's that sort of idea. And so who is he angry at? You want to know?
Angry at the Jews.
Angry at the Jews. It's this show of unbelief that he seems to be angry with. This sort of, could he not have opened the eyes of this man? And like, he did that. Why can't he save this one from dying? And it's this sort of heart posture that he knows is there because he's God. But also, just because that's the only thing that's recorded in this section doesn't mean that's the only thing that someone, people are whispering. People are always murmuring. He's the talk of the town. And so he's got to be hearing this unbelief. And really the only time that we see Jesus crying, weeping, is in response to the unbelief of the Jews. We'll see this in Luke 1941 as well.
That's interesting because it's like everybody's, oh, it's the shortest verse in the whole Bible. Jesus wept. Jesus is compassionate because he wept. But if in real context, when you read the Bible in context, you're like, oh, he was mad. And so it's just like angry tear. And he probably like he wasn't weepy, and he was just like, your eyes get watery when you're mad.
Right. And what's so funny is, and I didn't even think about it, but the grief study that got canceled, ironically, because I was grieving, the first night that was supposed to, or first day, whatever, that was supposed to exist would have been on this very concept. We'll see it in Genesis 6:6, this idea that God was grieved that he created man. And depending on your translation, it'll say that he regretted or that he repented. And those are technically correct translations, but that's not really what that means. But this idea that God grieves over sin and over this distant relationship that man has with him, because why would man be sinning so rapidly and so aggressively if they weren't distant from him? And it's a very similar idea, this weeping that Jesus does. And again, the Luke reference is him crying over Jerusalem. But like I said, that's 1941. Luke 1941. That same word is the one used in verse 38. We haven't gotten there yet, and I don't need to tell you twice. But it says that he was deeply moved again and came to the tomb. And so it kind of sandwiches this. Some of them were like, see how much he loved him, but then some of them were like, couldn't he have just done this ahead of time already? So I think it even further points to the fact that he was mad.
Mm-hmm. And on top of that, it's the Jews that he's mad at. These are people who are supposed to be God's chosen people. They're supposed to be the closest to God of any people on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And yet here he is standing in front of them and they don't recognize him. So, yeah.
All right. If y'all are ready, I'm going to make him read again. Right. This is 38 through 44.
Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me. But I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go."
All right. So part 2. That should not have been a break, but there it was. And we've already mentioned he's been dead for 4 days. He's stinky. He's stanky. But he's like, no. Take the stone away. Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? He said this to the disciples and not to Mary or Martha. Do keep that in mind. He could have maybe said it to the messenger, because we don't see the messenger leave him. And so maybe the messenger said something to them. But this, you would see the glory of God, was only said to the disciples back in 4. It's alluded to when he's speaking to Martha. This idea that you'll see the glory of God, but he does not directly say anything about the glory of God to her. Verse 41 It says, so they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes. Took away and lifted are the same word, and it, I think, should have been translated as such in all the English translations. I don't know. I didn't look at all of the English translations, so I don't know if you guys have different translations in front of you, if they are the same, but it should both be lifted. They lifted the stone, and Jesus lifted his eyes. It's a marker for the fact that they're doing the human work, even though they were asked to do it. And Jesus is praying. He's connected with God, and they're just responding to what he is saying. He begins his prayer by thanking God, which is something he does seemingly out of habit, and not necessarily that that's a bad thing, but this is something that we see him consistently doing. You'll see it in John 6, which is, I think, the feeding of 5,000. I don't remember exactly. 6, 11, and 23. Yeah. 11 is when he blesses the food. And then 23, actually, I don't know why it says that. So maybe just 11. But when he blesses the food before distributing it for the feeding of the 5,000, he thanks God. And it's just a maybe worthy note. We spend a lot of time looking at the Heavenly Father prayer, which by all means look at it, use it as a template, pray the prayer itself if you want to, I don't care. But this idea that prayer maybe should begin with thanks, or at least should often begin with thanksgiving, is also something we see in Nehemiah. His prayer at the beginning of the book of Nehemiah begins with thanksgiving. So, of course, maybe. The next time we will see Christ crying out with a loud voice is on the cross. And after that is in the book of Revelation. It's a denotation of power, but also it's his last utterance. Like the last thing as a human he says before he dies is the noise he makes. Like it's, I don't know, the fact that he's raising someone right now, and then I just think it's neat. I have a note here from, I don't know, I didn't note it, but like a good shepherd who calls his own sheep by name, Lazarus is personally called forth. He's not just yelling. He didn't just make the loud noise. He cries out with a loud voice, Lazarus. And the good shepherd I am statement is just before this. It's 10, what? Let's see. I am the door is verse 9, and good shepherd is verse 11 of chapter 10. So just him. And then the binding, the linen strips and his face wrapped with cloth, both also point to him potentially being contagious. The fact that that's really the only thing that was going on, but also faces weren't always bound like that, and sometimes that could be a mark of something contagious. How did he walk? How did he walk if his legs were bound?
Like a veggie.
Like a vest. There's some scholars debate that was also part of the miracle, was that he was somehow walking despite being bound, but also that he becomes unbound by death at the command of Jesus. These are markers of death, right? Like you and I don't walk around looking like a mummy but he comes out of the tomb and then at the command of Jesus is unbound. And so it's sort of this symbology that we see of um our chains are gone kind of thing. It's a similar idea. And I do want to note, I always want to note, and I did remember to put it in the Google Doc, no idea, that the word face here is only in John's writings, which points to this being all the same John. That's something that's like heavily uh like critics love to, well, it's not the same John. But he uses a lot of very specific words that are only found in his writings. And so anytime that there's evidence, I like to do that. Are you guys ready for the last section? After that, you ready? I have like one note and then we're done.
Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. Jesus, therefore, no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness, to a town called Ephraim, and there he stayed with the disciples. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and saying to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? That he will not come to the feast at all?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should let them know so that they might arrest him.
All right. So this accidental prophecy from Caiaphas, the Sanhedrin felt that if he were allowed to continue, that the Romans would view his mass following as sort of like an insurrection and destroy them, which they ended up doing anyway. So a little funny. I'm not gonna lie, a little funny. But he's irritated by their indecision and recommends that simply one man should die in place of all the people. And it's just it's very odd that is so skipped over, I think. I've never in my life seen that talked about, and I couldn't find very much on it. But that's the gospel, right? One man dies in place of the people. And he's doing it accidentally, but you also, and I'll let you talk in just a second. Sure. He's the high priest, which was already a tainted role, right? It was now like a politicized, if you know kind of anything about like what was going on with the Romans and the Jews and everything, it had become a political place and not just this like line of secession that had been going on. Even when Jesus was a baby, it was different. Just in the amount of time it took him to get to his 30s, there was so much more corruption. But even still, as high priest, he becomes a mouthpiece for God, right? And so it seems that this is his only ever prophecy, and it was an accident. But you have a note.
I made a little note. I remembered a older passage. I read verse 51, where it says, "He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation." It reminded me of when back in 1 Samuel 19, verse 23, Saul, during his pursuit of David, the Spirit of God came upon him and he began to prophesy. it doesn't tell us what Saul was prophesying, but Lily had got me looking at throughout the Bible, seeing what she called shadows of Jesus or reflections of Jesus. And I kind of saw a reflection of what was to come in that moment, because we have the leader of the Jews chasing down a Christ-like figure. David is an
Christ type.
imperfect Jesus, and he's going to capture David and ends up prophesying, who knows what, but prophesying, and being unable to do anything else but prophesy, so that David gets away. But it was an interesting comparison, reflection.
I would call it another shadow.
Yeah.
And I am a Davidic kingdom hater. I hate reading that section of the Bible. Samuel through Chronicles is my kryptonite.
Thing to add, that in that passage it says that Saul strips himself down naked and prophesied. And I think a lot of scholars, at least the Cambridge one I read, stated that it didn't mean that he was literally but naked, is that he was down to his undergarments.
He was stripped of his king's garb.
But not wearing his king's garb anymore.
I know I said I had one note, but I do want to mention, just because we are going to start with Passover stuff, it's saying that they are there to purify themselves, verse 55, and that's not part of the, but like there's not like a ritual going on here. It's not part of what they had to do, but many Jews would get there early to purify themselves, because they didn't need to be pure in order to participate. It just wasn't part of like something sanctioned, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So I do want to note that, because it's probably not going to get brought up ever again. All right. Does anyone have anything to say? Questions, comments, concerns, or anything about this entire chapter? It's a long and a thick, and we hopefully won't spend too much time in John for the rest of this study. We do have, John has whole sections, like the upper room discourse is only recorded in John, and so in a couple of weeks we will be back here and in the thick of it, like quicksand, it feels like, but it's good. It's I'm not complaining. It's just a lot. I'm going to